Deep within the marble corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace, where whispers carry more weight than proclamations, and shadows hold centuries of secrets, 12-year-old Princess Isabella discovered something that would forever change how she viewed everyone around her. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the Forgotten Tower Library, a crimson leather folder contained detailed files on every single person who worked within the palace walls. But these weren't ordinary employment records. These files revealed secrets, scandals, fears, and hidden connections that painted a completely different picture of the people she had trusted her entire life. What started as innocent curiosity about a mysterious folder would lead Isabella down a path of discovery that questioned everything she thought she knew about loyalty, trust, and the true nature of power within the ancient walls of her home. Princess Isabella had always been different from her older siblings. While Prince Alexander focused on his military training and Princess Victoria perfected her diplomatic studies, Isabella found herself drawn to the forgotten corners of Raven's Hollow Palace. The 12-year-old had an insatiable curiosity that often led her to places she probably shouldn't be. But today's discovery would prove to be the most significant of her young life. The morning had started like any other in the sprawling palace that had housed the fictional kingdom of Eldermere's royal family for over 4 centuries. Isabella finished her morning lessons with her tutor, Mrs. Pemberton, earlier than usual. The elderly woman had received an urgent message from the Queen's private secretary and had to cut their history lesson short. Left with an unexpected hour of free time before lunch, Isabella decided to explore the North Tower, a section of the palace that had been largely abandoned since the Great Fire of 1847. The North Tower's spiral staircase creaked under her feet as she climbed past dusty portraits of long-dead relatives. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, creating dancing patterns on the stone walls. Isabella had explored most of the tower before, but today she noticed something different. On the 3rd floor, in what used to be the old library before the main library was built in the east wing, one of the wooden floorboards seemed slightly raised. Her curiosity piqued, Isabella knelt down and examined the board more closely. It was loose, and with a little effort, she managed to pry it up. Beneath the board was a small, hollow space, and nestled inside was a thick crimson leather folder, its edges worn with age but the material still supple. The folder was tied with a black ribbon, and embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering were the words, "Personnel Assessments, Confidential." Isabella's heart raced as she carefully lifted the folder from its hiding place. She knew she was probably crossing a line by looking at something marked "Confidential," but her curiosity won over her better judgment. She untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and opened the folder. Inside were dozens of manila files, each labeled with a name she recognized. The first file she saw bore the name Margaret Henley, head cook. Isabella knew Mrs. Henley well. The woman had worked in the palace kitchens for over 20 years and had always been kind to Isabella, often sneaking her extra desserts when her parents weren't looking. But as Isabella read the file, she discovered things about Mrs. Henley that she never could have imagined. According to the document, Mrs. Henley had not always been Margaret Henley. She had changed her name from Margaret Sullivan after fleeing Ireland in 1998. The file detailed how she had been involved with a group of political activists in Belfast and had to leave the country when several of her associates were arrested. The document noted that while Mrs. Henley herself had never been charged with any crime, her association with the group made her a potential security risk, though it concluded that her loyalty to the royal family appeared genuine after years of observation. Isabella's hand shook as she read. Mrs. Henley, who had taught Isabella how to bake Christmas cookies and had always seemed like the most straightforward person in the palace, had been living under an assumed identity for over 2 decades. The next file was even more shocking. James Crawford, head butler. Mr. Crawford was a tall, stern man who had served the royal family for 15 years. He was known for his impeccable manners and his ability to anticipate the family's needs before they even knew they had them. But the file revealed that James Crawford had significant gambling debts and had, on 3 separate occasions, borrowed money from questionable sources to cover his losses. The document noted that while there was no evidence of him stealing from the palace or compromising security, his financial situation made him potentially vulnerable to external pressure. She realized that these files contained information that could destroy people's careers and reputations. But who had compiled them, and why were they hidden in an abandoned tower? She continued reading file after file, revealing secrets about people she had known her entire life. Sarah Mitchell, one of the younger maids, was apparently the daughter of a convicted forger, though she herself had never been involved in any illegal activities. Thomas Wright, the head groundskeeper, had served time in prison for assault in his youth, something that happened over 30 years ago, and for which he had apparently reformed completely. Even Dr. Papina K.K. Joan. Elizabeth Harper, the royal family's personal physician, had a file noting that she had struggled with prescription drug addiction early in her career, though she had been clean for over a decade.
As Isabella read through more files, she began to notice a pattern.
Each file was incredibly detailed, containing information that went far beyond what would typically be included in employment records. They included details about family members, financial situations, past relationships, and even psychological assessments. It was as if someone had been conducting deep background investigations on every person who worked in the palace. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that these files weren't just about past secrets. Many contained recent observations and updates. Someone was actively monitoring the palace staff, documenting their behaviors, their conversations, and their potential vulnerabilities. The afternoon sun had moved significantly across the sky when Isabella finally looked up from the files. She had been reading for hours, completely absorbed in the shocking revelations about people she thought she knew. Her stomach churned as she thought about Mrs. Henley's warm smile, knowing now that it hid decades of fear about her past being discovered. She thought about Mr. Crawford's proud demeanor, understanding now that it might be masking deep anxiety about his financial problems. Isabella carefully retied the ribbon around the folder and placed it back in its hiding spot. She replaced the floorboard and tried to make it look as if it had never been disturbed. But as she made her way back down the tower stairs, her mind raced with questions. Who had created these files? Were her parents aware of them? Was someone in the palace secretly investigating everyone who worked there? As she walked through the corridors toward her family's private dining room for dinner, Isabella found herself looking at the staff members she passed with new eyes. The young footman who smiled and bowed as she passed, did he have secrets too? The elderly woman who tended the palace gardens, what was in her file? Dinner that evening was a formal affair, as it always was on Wednesdays when the king and queen dined with all three children. Isabella found it difficult to concentrate on the conversation about the upcoming state visit from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. Her mind kept wandering to the crimson folder and its devastating contents. "Isabella, you seem distracted this evening,"
observed Queen Cordelia, her sharp eyes studying her youngest daughter.
"Is everything all right?" Isabella forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mother. Just tired from my studies." King Edmund nodded approvingly. Education can be taxing, but it's the foundation of good leadership. Speaking of which, how are your diplomatic protocol lessons progressing? Very well, Father, Isabella replied automatically, though she could barely remember what she had studied that morning. Her discovery of the files had pushed everything else from her mind. As the dinner conversation continued around her, Isabella made a decision. She needed to understand more about those files, who had created them, and why. Were there more files hidden elsewhere in the palace? And most importantly, did her parents know about the extensive surveillance of their own staff? But she also realized that she would have to be very careful. If the files were as sensitive as they appeared to be, whoever had hidden them would not want them discovered. Isabella was beginning to understand that the palace, which had always seemed like the safest place in the world, might actually be full of hidden dangers and carefully guarded secrets. After dinner, as Isabella prepared for bed in her ornate bedroom, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her home. The people who had cared for her since childhood, who had seemed like extended family, all had hidden depths and secret histories. And somewhere in the palace, someone was watching and documenting everything. As she lay in her four-poster bed, staring up at the canopy decorated with her family's coat of arms, Isabella made a promise to herself. She would uncover the truth about those files, no matter what it took. She owed it to Mrs. Henley, Mr. Crawford, and all the other staff members whose secrets had been exposed. But more than that, she owed it to herself to understand what kind of world she was truly living in. The palace that had once felt like a fairy tale now seemed more like a mystery that she was determined to solve. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate even the thick stone walls of Ravenshollow Palace. Isabella woke earlier than usual, her dreams having been filled with shadowy figures and crimson folders. As she dressed for the day, she made a decision that would set her on a dangerous path of discovery. During her morning lessons with Mrs. Pemberton, Isabella found it nearly impossible to concentrate on the French Revolution. Every time her tutor mentioned surveillance and secret police, Isabella's thoughts returned to those files. She began to wonder if Mrs. Pemberton herself might have a file hidden somewhere in that crimson folder. The elderly woman had worked at the palace for over a decade, having come to them with impeccable references from a prestigious boarding school. But now Isabella questioned whether those references told the whole story. When the lesson ended, Isabella excused herself and made her way back to the North Tower. She had to see those files again to make sure she hadn't imagined the whole thing. But more than that, she wanted to study them more carefully to see if she could determine who had compiled them. The tower seemed even more foreboding in the grey morning light. As Isabella climbed the stairs, she noticed details she had missed the day before. There were fewer cobwebs in certain corners, suggesting someone else had been here recently. Some of the dust on the windowsills had been disturbed, and there were faint scuff marks on the floor that didn't look old. When she reached the third floor and pried up the loose floorboard, her heart nearly stopped. The hiding place was empty. Isabella frantically checked the surrounding floorboards, thinking perhaps she had remembered the wrong location, but there was no mistaking it. This was definitely where she had found the crimson folder yesterday. Someone had discovered that it was missing and had moved it. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down Isabella's spine. Someone knew that she had found the files, but who? And more importantly, what would they do about it? As she carefully replaced the floorboard, Isabella heard footsteps on the stairs below. Heavy, measured footsteps that belonged to someone much larger than herself. She quickly looked around the library for a place to hide. The room was mostly empty except for some old bookcases and a large desk that had been pushed against one wall. Isabella ducked behind the desk just as the footsteps reached the third floor. Through a gap in the desk, she could see polished black shoes and perfectly pressed grey trousers. She recognized them immediately. They belonged to Mr. Dellery. Aldrich, the palace's head of security. Isabella held her breath as she watched him walk directly to the loose floorboard. He knelt down and examined it carefully, running his fingers along the edges. "I know you're here, Your Highness," Mr. Aldrich said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the empty room. "There's no point in hiding." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She considered staying hidden, but she realized that if Mr. Aldrich already knew she was there, attempting to hide would only make things worse. Slowly, she stood up from behind the desk. Mr. Aldrich was a man in his 50s with graying hair and intense blue eyes. He had worked at the palace for as long as Isabella could remember, and she had always found him somewhat intimidating. Now, seeing him standing over the hiding place she had discovered, he seemed downright frightening.
"Good morning, Princess Isabella," he said formally, rising to his feet.
"I believe we need to have a conversation." Isabella tried to summon her royal dignity, despite feeling like a child caught stealing cookies.
"Good morning, Mr. Aldrich. I was just exploring." "Indeed you were," he replied, his expression unreadable. "And what did you discover during your exploration yesterday? There was no point in pretending ignorance." "I found some files," Isabella admitted. "Files about the palace staff." Mr. Aldrich nodded slowly. "And what did you think of these files?" The question surprised Isabella. She had expected him to be angry or to immediately escort her back to her parents. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about her reaction. "I thought they were terrible," Isabella said honestly. "All those secrets about people who work here. It felt like spying." "Interesting perspective, Mr. Koo," Aldrich mused. "Walk with me, Your Highness. I think it's time you understood some things about palace security." As they descended the tower stairs together, Mr. Aldrich began to explain. "Those files you discovered are part of a security protocol that has been in place for over 50 years. Every person who works in close proximity to the royal family undergoes extensive background investigation. But the things in those files," Isabella protested, "Mrs. Henley's past in Ireland, Mr. Crawford's gambling debts, those are private matters. Privacy is a luxury that we cannot afford when it comes to royal security," Mr. Aldrich replied gravely. "Consider this. If Mr. Crawford's gambling debts became unmanageable, he might be tempted to sell information about the family's daily routines to unsavory characters. If Mrs. Henley's past were to be discovered by hostile forces, they might attempt to blackmail her into compromising the family's food security." Isabella felt a knot forming in her stomach. "So you're saying everyone who works here is potentially dangerous?"
I'm saying that everyone who works here is human, Mr.
Aldrich corrected. "Humans have weaknesses, make mistakes, and can be manipulated. Our job is to understand these vulnerabilities so we can protect against them." They had reached the main floor of the palace, and Mr. Aldrich led Isabella through a corridor she had never seen before. It was behind the main kitchen and required a keycard to access. The hallway was utilitarian, with no decorations or windows, and it felt more like a government building than part of the palace she knew. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked. "To the Security Operations Center, Mr. B," Aldrich replied. "I think you need to see the full scope of what we do here." The Security Operations Center was like nothing Isabella had ever seen. Banks of monitors covered one wall, showing feeds from security cameras throughout the palace and grounds. Several people in plain clothes sat at computer workstations, analyzing data and monitoring communications. It looked more like something from a spy movie than part of her home. "This is where we coordinate all security operations for the royal family, Mr. Prism," Aldrich explained. "We monitor potential threats, analyze intelligence reports, and yes, maintain detailed files on everyone who has access to the family." A woman with short dark hair approached them. Isabella recognized her as Miss Catherine Moore, someone she had occasionally seen around the palace but had never really interacted with. She had assumed Ms. Moore worked in administration. "Your Highness?" Ms. Moore said with a slight bow. "I'm the Deputy Director of Palace Security. I understand you've discovered some of our files." Isabella nodded, feeling increasingly out of her depth. "The files you found yesterday contain information that could be dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands," Miss Moore continued. "We moved them as soon as we realized they had been accessed." "How did you know I had found them?" Isabella asked. "Miss Moore exchanged a glance with Mr. Aldrich. "The floorboard has a pressure sensor underneath it. Any time it's disturbed, we receive an alert." Isabella felt simultaneously impressed and violated by this revelation. "So you've been watching me?" "We watch everyone," Mr. Aldrich said simply. "It's not personal, Your Highness. It's professional." Moore gestured toward one of the computer workstations. "Would you like to see how we protect your family?" Despite her misgivings, Isabella found herself nodding. Ms. Moore led her to a workstation where a young man was analyzing what appeared to be social media posts. "We monitor public sentiment about the royal family," Ms. Moore explained. "We look for potential threats, but also for opportunities to address public concerns before they become problems." On another monitor, Isabella could see a map of the palace grounds, with small dots moving around. "Each member of the royal family and key staff wear discrete tracking devices," Ms. Moore continued. "This allows us to respond immediately if there's an emergency." Isabella instinctively touched her school pin, wondering if that innocuous piece of jewelry was actually a tracking device.
"I know this is a lot to take in,"
Mr. Aldrich said, noticing Isabella's overwhelmed expression. "But I want you to understand something important. Everything we do here is designed to keep your family safe. The world is not always as kind to royal families as it once was." "But what about the staff?" Isabella asked. "What about their privacy? Their dignity?" Ms. Moore's expression softened slightly. "That's a fair question, Your Highness. We try to balance security needs with respect for personal privacy. The information in those files is shared only with people who have the highest security clearances, and it's used only for security purposes." But Mrs. Ashcansad, "Henley doesn't know you have a file on her past in Ireland," Isabella pointed out. "Mr. Crawford doesn't know you're monitoring his financial situation. How is that fair?" Moore exchanged another glance, and Isabella could see that her questions were making them uncomfortable. "Some things are better left unspoken." "Mr. Rise," Aldrich finally said. "Mrs. B. Henley is an excellent cook and has served the family loyally for years. Her past doesn't define her present, but we need to be aware of it in case someone else tries to use it against her or the family." "What happens if someone's file reveals something really serious?" Isabella asked. "That depends on the nature of the revelation," Miss Moore replied carefully. "If we discovered that someone posed a genuine threat to the family, they would be quietly removed from their position. But most of the time, we simply monitor the situation and provide additional security measures if necessary." Isabella thought about this for a moment. "Has anyone ever been removed because of their file?" Again, the two security officers exchanged glances. "There have been a few instances," Mr. Aldrich admitted. "But those involved serious security concerns, not minor personal matters." As Isabella absorbed this information, she realized that her discovery of the Crimson Folder had opened her eyes to a world she had never known existed. The palace wasn't just her home. It was a complex security operation designed to protect her family from threats she had never even imagined. But it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of trust and surveillance. If her parents' security team was monitoring everyone around them, including people who had served faithfully for years, what did that say about the kind of world they were living in? "I have one more question," Isabella said. "Do my parents know about all of this?" Aldrich smiled for the first time since she had met him in the tower. "Your parents created this system, Your Highness. They understand better than anyone the importance of security." As Isabella left the Security Operations Center and returned to the familiar corridors of the palace, she felt as if she was seeing everything with new eyes. The smiling faces of the staff members she passed now seemed to hide layers of complexity she had never imagined. Every room might contain hidden cameras. Every conversation might be monitored, and every person might have secrets that could change everything. The palace that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a fortress, and Isabella wasn't sure if she was being protected or imprisoned. The revelation about the palace's extensive security operations haunted Isabella for the rest of the week. Every interaction with the staff felt different now that she knew about the files and the constant surveillance. When Mrs. Cercoria, did you be? Henley smiled at her during breakfast. Isabella wondered if the cook was aware that her every move was being monitored. When Mr. Bell, Crawford delivered the Daily Mail with his usual formal politeness. Isabella couldn't help but think about his gambling debts, and whether he lay awake at night worrying about discovery. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that her parents had created and maintained this system. The king and queen she had always seen as benevolent leaders who cared deeply about their subjects were also the architects of an operation that seemed to violate the privacy and trust of everyone around them. Isabella decided she needed to learn more, but she also realized she would have to be much more careful. If the security team had detected her discovery of the files so quickly, they were probably monitoring her activities more closely now. She began to pay attention to small details she had previously overlooked, the way certain staff members seemed to appear wherever she went, how conversations sometimes stopped when she entered a room, and the subtle ways her daily routine was managed and controlled. 3 days after her visit to the Security Operations Center, Isabella overheard a conversation that changed everything. She was walking past the Queen's private study when she heard her mother speaking on the phone, in a tone Isabella had never heard before, sharp, cold, and unmistakably threatening. "I don't care what his personal circumstances are," Queen Cordelia was saying. "If he can't be trusted, he needs to be removed immediately. We cannot afford any security risks, especially with the Asturian delegation arriving next week." Isabella pressed herself against the wall outside the study, her heart racing. She knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but something about her mother's tone made her fear for whoever they were discussing. "Yes, I understand he has a family to support," the Queen continued. "But that's not our concern. Our concern is protecting this family and this institution. Handle it quietly, but handle it definitively." There was a long pause, and when the Queen spoke again, her voice was even colder. "And, Catherine, make sure this doesn't happen again. I want a complete review of our screening procedures. If we miss something this significant, there may be other vulnerabilities we haven't identified." Isabella realized that her mother was speaking to Miss Durand. Catherine Moore, the Deputy Director of Security she had met earlier. Someone was being fired, possibly because of information contained in their security file. Someone with a family who depended on their palace income was about to lose everything because of secrets that had been discovered and documented without their knowledge. The phone call ended, and Isabella quickly moved away from the study before her mother emerged. But as she walked through the palace corridors, she couldn't shake the image of some unknown staff member receiving devastating news that would destroy their livelihood and reputation. That evening at dinner, Isabella decided to take a risk. As the family discussed the upcoming state visit from Astoria, she carefully steered the conversation toward the palace staff. "I've been thinking about how hard everyone works to make these state visits successful," Isabella said casually. "All the extra hours and preparation, I hope we take good care of our people." King Edmund nodded approvingly. "Absolutely. The palace staff are the backbone of everything we do. We're very fortunate to have such dedicated people. Do we ever have problems with staff members?" Isabella asked, trying to keep her voice innocent. "I mean, do people ever quit or have to be let go?" Queen Cordelia's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Isabella caught a brief flash of something in her mother's eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or calculation. "Occasionally," the Queen said carefully. "Sometimes people find that palace work isn't the right fit for them, and very rarely we discover that someone isn't suitable for the unique requirements of royal service." "What kind of requirements?" Prince Alexander asked, genuinely curious. As the heir to the throne, he was beginning to take more interest in palace operations. "Security clearances mainly," King Edmund replied. "Anyone who works closely with the royal family must undergo extensive background checks. Sometimes these reveal issues that weren't apparent during the initial hiring process." "What kind of issues?" Princess Victoria inquired, always the diplomat interested in the nuances of managing people. Isabella watched her parents exchange a glance that lasted only a split second but spoke volumes about their shared understanding of palace security matters. "Nothing dramatic," Queen Cordelia said smoothly. "Perhaps financial troubles that could make someone vulnerable to external pressure, or past associations that might create security concerns. We have to be very careful about who has access to our family and our private information. Has anyone been dismissed recently? Isabella asked, unable to contain her curiosity. The silence that followed her question lasted only a moment, but it felt much longer. King Edmund set down his wineglass and studied his youngest daughter with new attention. "That's a very specific question, Isabella," he said slowly. "Is there something particular that prompted it?" Isabella felt as if she were walking on thin ice. "I just noticed that one of the junior staff members hasn't been around lately, someone I used to see in the corridors."
It was a lie, but Isabella hoped it would explain her interest without revealing what she had overheard.
Staff assignments change frequently, Queen Cordelia said briskly.
People are moved between different departments, take leave, or pursue other opportunities. I wouldn't expect you to keep track of every staff member's schedule. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Isabella noticed that both her parents seemed more guarded for the rest of the meal. She had definitely touched on something sensitive, and she suspected they would be more watchful of her questions in the future. After dinner, Isabella excused herself to her room, claiming she needed to study for an upcoming examination. But instead of opening her books, she sat at her desk and began to make a list of all the staff members she could remember seeing regularly over the past few weeks. Then she tried to think of anyone who had been noticeably absent. It took merely an hour, but finally she remembered. David Mitchell, one of the younger footmen who had worked in the palace for about 2 years. She hadn't seen him in at least a week, maybe longer. David had always been friendly and cheerful, often stopping to chat briefly when he delivered messages or assisted with minor tasks around the palace. Isabella realized that David Mitchell might be the person her mother had been discussing on the phone, the person who had been removed because he posed a security risk, the person with a family who depended on his palace income. But what had they discovered about David? What was in his security file that had led to his dismissal? The next morning, Isabella made a decision that she knew was risky, but felt necessary. During her morning break between lessons, she went to the servants' quarters, an area of the palace she rarely visited. The servants' quarters were located in the basement level and consisted of a series of small rooms and common areas where the staff could rest and eat their meals. Isabella had been to this area only a few times in her life, usually when she was very young and had gotten lost while exploring. As she made her way down the narrow stairs, she could hear voices from the common area ahead. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening to see if she could learn anything useful. "It's not right," she heard someone saying in a low, angry voice. "David worked harder than anyone, and they threw him out like yesterday's garbage." "Keep your voice down," another voice warned. "You know they listen to everything we say. Let them listen." The first voice replied bitterly, "We all know what happened. One day David's here, the next day his access card doesn't work and security escorts him off the property. No explanation, no chance to defend himself. Nothing." Isabella recognized the second voice as belonging to Thomas Chen, one of the palace maintenance workers. The first voice was harder to identify, but she thought it might be Sarah Williams, a housekeeping supervisor. "They found something in his background," Thomas said quietly. "Something that made them think he was a risk." "What kind of risk?" Sarah asked. "David wouldn't hurt a fly. He was saving money to propose to his girlfriend, for crying out loud." "It doesn't matter what kind of person he really is," Thomas replied sadly. "It only matters what's in their files. And once something goes in those files, there's no getting it out." Isabella felt a chill as she realized that the staff knew about the security files. They might not know the details, but they understood that their lives were being documented and analyzed by people who had the power to destroy their careers without warning or explanation. "Do you think they have files on all of us?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that was clearly terrifying her. "I'd bet my last paycheck on it," Thomas said grimly. "Every mistake you've ever made, every person you've ever associated with, every financial problem you've ever had, it's all in there somewhere. And when they decide you're not worth the risk anymore, that's it. You're done." Isabella heard footsteps approaching and quickly retreated up the stairs before she could be discovered. But as she made her way back to the main palace, the conversation she had overheard echoed in her mind. David Mitchell had been fired, not for anything he had done, but for something in his background that the security team deemed problematic. He had lost his job, his income, and his future without ever knowing what he had been accused of or having a chance to defend himself. The staff lived in constant fear of the security files, knowing that their livelihoods depended on the judgment of people who watched them from the shadows. Mrs. Henley smiled and baked cookies while worrying that her past in Ireland might someday catch up with her. Mr. Crawford performed his duties with perfect professionalism while knowing that his gambling debts made him vulnerable. Every member of the palace staff carried the burden of secrets that could be used against them at any moment. Isabella realized that her discovery of the Crimson Folder had been just the beginning. She was starting to understand that the palace operated on a foundation of fear and surveillance that affected everyone who lived and worked there. The question was, what was she going to do about it? As she returned to her lessons for the day, Isabella made a decision that would prove to be both dangerous and transformative. She was going to find David Mitchell and learn the truth about what had led to his dismissal. But more than that, she was going to find a way to challenge the system that allowed such injustices to occur. She didn't yet understand the full scope of what she was up against, or the risks she would face in pursuing this path. But for the first time in her young life, Princess Isabella felt a sense of moral purpose that was stronger than her desire for safety and comfort. The palace might be her home, but it was also a place where good people lived in fear and suffered in silence. And she was determined to change that, no matter what it cost her. Finding David Mitchell proved to be more challenging than Isabella had anticipated. She couldn't simply ask the palace staff for his contact information without arousing suspicion, and she certainly couldn't involve the security team who had been responsible for his dismissal. Instead, she had to rely on careful observation and patient detective work. Isabella began by paying closer attention to conversations among the staff, hoping to pick up clues about David's whereabouts or contact information. She also started spending more time in areas of the palace where staff members gathered during their breaks, always with a plausible excuse for being there. Gradually, she began to piece together information about David's situation. From fragments of overheard conversations, she learned that David had been living in a small apartment in the nearby village of Millbrook, about 3 miles from the palace. He had been dating a local girl named Emma who worked at the village bakery, and he had been saving money to buy an engagement ring. The sudden loss of his palace position had apparently devastated both his financial situation and his relationship plans. Isabella also discovered that David had a younger sister named Sophie who attended the local comprehensive school. This information came from Mrs. Good Patterson, the palace's head of housekeeping, who mentioned during a staff meeting that she felt terrible about David's situation because she knew how much he worried about his sister's education expenses. Armed with this information, Isabella devised a plan to contact David without revealing her identity or involving palace security. She decided to write him a letter. But she couldn't use palace stationery or send it through official channels. Instead, she would have to mail it herself from the village post office. Getting to the village without an official escort required careful planning. Isabella had some freedom to move around the palace grounds, but leaving the estate entirely was a different matter. However, she remembered that Thursday afternoons were reserved for her riding lessons with Master James Thornton, who taught equestrian skills at a stable just outside the palace gates. The stable was only about a mile from Millbrook village, and Isabella was often allowed to cool down her horse by riding along the public bridle paths after her lessons. On Thursday afternoon, Isabella participated in her usual riding lesson, but instead of returning directly to the palace afterward, she asked Master Thornton if she could take an extended cool-down ride. The instructor, who had been teaching her for years and trusted her riding skills, agreed to let her ride alone for 30 minutes along the familiar trails. Instead of following the usual path back to the palace, Isabella guided her horse toward Millbrook village. She had brought a small backpack with her containing the letter she had written to David, some cash from her personal allowance, and a change of clothes that would make her less recognizable as a member of the royal family. The village of Millbrook was small and quaint, with a main street lined with shops and cottages that looked like something from a fairy tale. Isabella had visited the village before during official royal functions, but never alone and never incognito. She tied her horse at a public hitching post near the village green and changed into jeans and a simple sweater she had brought with her, hiding her distinctive riding clothes in the backpack. The post office was located in a small building that also housed the village general store. Isabella approached the counter nervously, hoping that the elderly woman behind the desk wouldn't recognize her despite her casual clothes. "I'd like to send this letter, please," Isabella said, trying to disguise her voice slightly by speaking more quietly than usual. The postal clerk, a friendly woman who appeared to be in her 70s, barely looked up as she weighed the letter and calculated the postage. "That'll be £1.20, dear." Isabella paid the fee and watched as the woman stamped the envelope and placed it in the outgoing mail basket. The letter was addressed simply to David Mitchell, Millbrook Village, with a request that it be forwarded if he had moved. Isabella hoped that in a small village like Millbrook, the postal service would be able to locate him even without a specific address. In the letter, Isabella had identified herself only as a friend from the palace who was concerned about the circumstances of his dismissal. She had asked him to meet her the following Thursday afternoon at a small cafe in the village called the Copper Kettle, and she had promised to explain why his situation mattered to her and how she might be able to help. Isabella had struggled with how much to reveal in the letter. She couldn't identify herself as a member of the royal family without creating enormous security risks, but she also needed to convince David that she was worth trusting. In the end, she had settled on suggesting that she worked in the palace administration and had access to information about his dismissal that might be helpful to him. As Isabella prepared to return to the palace, she made one more stop. The village bakery where David's girlfriend Emma worked was just a few doors down from the post office. Isabella entered the shop, which smelled wonderfully of fresh bread and pastries, and approached the young woman behind the counter. Emma appeared to be in her early 20s, with auburn hair and kind eyes that looked tired and sad. When she smiled at Isabella, it didn't quite reach her eyes, and Isabella suspected that David's dismissal had affected her deeply. "Good afternoon," Isabella said. "I'd like a dozen of your butter biscuits, please." As Emma packaged the biscuits, Isabella gathered her courage and said carefully, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard that someone named David who used to work at the palace was a friend of yours. I hope he's doing well." Emma's expression immediately became guarded.
"Who's asking?" "Just someone who worked with him occasionally," Isabella replied. "I was sorry to hear about what happened."
Emma's eyes filled with tears that she quickly tried to blink away.
"David's a good person," she said fiercely. "Whatever they think he did, they're wrong about him. He would never hurt anyone or do anything dishonest." "I believe that," Isabella said gently. "Sometimes institutions make mistakes about people. Has he been able to find other work?" "He's trying," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. "But word gets around in a small community. When someone is dismissed from the palace for security reasons, other employers assume the worst. David can't even get a job at the local grocery store now because they're afraid he'll steal from them." Isabella felt a surge of anger on David's behalf. Not only had he been fired without explanation, but the circumstances of his dismissal were making it impossible for him to rebuild his life. "I'm very sorry," Isabella said sincerely. "I hope things improve for both of you." As Isabella rode back to the palace, her mind raced with thoughts about David and Emma's situation. She had seen firsthand how the palace security system destroyed not just careers, but entire lives. David's dreams of proposing to Emma had been shattered, along with his ability to support himself and his sister. The ripple effects of his dismissal extended far beyond just losing a job. The following Thursday, Isabella returned to Millbrook for her supposed riding lesson, but this time she was more nervous than she had been in her entire life. She had no idea if David had received her letter, or, if he had, whether he would trust her enough to meet with her. As she changed clothes near the village green, she realized that she was taking enormous risks not just for herself, but potentially for her entire family. If her parents discovered what she was doing, they would be furious and probably confine her to the palace indefinitely. If the security team learned about her investigation, they might view it as a threat to palace operations, and if her contact with David somehow became public knowledge, it could create a scandal that would damage the royal family's reputation. But despite these risks, Isabella knew she couldn't turn back. She had seen too much and learned too much to simply pretend that nothing was wrong with the palace security system. The Copper Kettle was a small, cozy cafe with mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls. Isabella arrived early and chose a table in the back corner, where she could see the entrance but would be less visible to other customers. She ordered tea and waited, checking her watch every few minutes and wondering if David would actually appear. At precisely 3 o'clock, a young man with dark hair and anxious eyes entered the cafe. Isabella recognized him immediately from seeing him around the palace, though he looked thinner and more haggard than she remembered. He scanned the cafe uncertainly until his gaze fell on Isabella, who gave him a small nod. David approached her table cautiously. "Are you the person who wrote to me?" "Yes," Isabella replied, gesturing for him to sit down. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you would trust a letter from a stranger." "I almost didn't come," David admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "But Emma convinced me that I should at least hear what you had to say. She said you seemed genuinely concerned when you spoke to her last week." Isabella felt a flush of guilt, realizing that Emma had mentioned their conversation to David. "I am concerned," she said honestly. "I think what happened to you was wrong, and I want to understand why it happened." David studied her carefully. "Your letter said you work in palace administration, but you look pretty young for that kind of position." Isabella had prepared for this question, but it was still difficult to answer without lying outright.
I'm in a unique position to access certain types of information, she said carefully. I can't explain all the details for security reasons, but I've seen your personnel file. David's expression darkened.
So you know what they accused me of? Actually, I don't, Isabella replied, surprising him. The file I saw mentioned that you had been removed for security reasons, but it didn't specify what those reasons were. I was hoping you could tell me. David laughed bitterly. That's the beautiful thing about their system. They don't have to tell you what you did wrong. They just escort you off the property and tell you that your security clearance has been revoked. But surely you must have some idea what triggered their concerns, Isabella pressed. David was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with anger and pain. My brother Marcus was arrested 6 months ago for drug possession, he said quietly. Not dealing, just possession of a small amount of cannabis for personal use. He got a fine, and community service, nothing serious. But apparently, that was enough to make me a security risk. Isabella felt her heart sink. They fired you because of something your brother did. They said that family members with criminal records, even minor ones, could make palace employees vulnerable to blackmail or coercion, David explained. They suggested that hostile forces might try to pressure me to provide information about the royal family by threatening to harm my brother or expose his drug use to his employer. The reasoning was so cold and calculating that Isabella felt sick. Did they give you any chance to explain or defend yourself? What was there to defend? David asked bitterly. Marcus did get arrested for drug possession, that's a fact. Whether or not I would ever betray the royal family because of it is apparently irrelevant. They decided I was a risk, and that was the end of the discussion. Isabella realized that David's case perfectly illustrated everything that was wrong with the palace security system. A loyal employee had been destroyed not because of anything he had done, but because of a minor legal issue involving a family member. The system treated human beings like potential security breaches rather than individuals with complex lives and relationships. I'm so sorry this happened to you, Isabella said sincerely. It's not fair and it's not right. The worst part is the way they've made it impossible for me to find other work, David continued. They won't give me a reference, and when potential employers call the palace, they're told that I was dismissed for security reasons. No one wants to hire someone who might be a security risk. As Isabella listened to David's story, she felt a growing sense of determination. She might only be 12 years old, but she had access to the palace power structure in ways that David never could. If the security system was destroying innocent people's lives, then someone needed to challenge it. And if that someone had to be her, then so be it. Isabella's meeting with David Mitchell had opened her eyes to the human cost of the palace security system, but it had also given her a sense of purpose unlike anything she had ever experienced. For the first time in her young life, she understood that being a princess meant more than just privilege and ceremony. It meant having the power and responsibility to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But challenging a security system that had been in place for decades, and that was supported by her own parents, would require more than just good intentions. Isabella needed a strategy that would force the palace leadership to confront the consequences of their policies without destroying her own position within the royal family. Over the following weeks, Isabella began to develop a plan that was both ambitious and risky. She decided to document cases like David's, building a comprehensive record of people whose lives had been damaged by the palace security system. But she also realized that she needed allies, people within the palace structure, who might be willing to support reform if they understood the full scope of the problems. Isabella's first potential ally was someone she had never expected to trust: Mrs. Margaret Henley, the head cook whose own secret past had been documented in the Crimson Folder. Isabella reasoned that Mrs. Soul Henley, more than anyone else, would understand the psychological burden of living under constant surveillance while maintaining a facade of normalcy. The challenge was approaching Mrs. Pentry. Henley, without revealing too much about what Isabella knew or how she had learned it, Isabella decided to begin by simply spending more time in the kitchen areas, engaging Mrs. Debochere Henley in conversations that might naturally lead to discussions about palace employment and security. Mrs. Henley, Isabella said one afternoon as she sat at the kitchen table where the cook had taught her to make Christmas cookies the year before. Have you ever worried about losing your job here at the palace? Mrs. Henley looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, her expression carefully neutral. Why would you ask such a question, Your Highness? I've been thinking about how much the staff members sacrifice to work here, Isabella replied carefully. You all have to undergo background checks and security clearances. It must be stressful to know that your past is being examined so closely. Mrs. Henley's hand stilled on the dough, and Isabella could see that she had struck a nerve. Everyone has a past, Your Highness, the cook said quietly. The question is whether people are judged by their mistakes or by their character. What if someone had made mistakes a long time ago, but they had completely changed their life? Isabella asked. Should they still be punished for those old mistakes? Mrs. Henley began kneading the dough again, but with more force than necessary. That would depend on the nature of the mistakes, I suppose, and on whether the people making the judgments are wise enough to see the difference between who someone was and who they have become. Isabella sensed that Mrs. Henley was speaking from personal experience, and she decided to take a calculated risk. I heard that one of the footmen was recently dismissed for security reasons, someone named David Mitchell. Do you know what happened? Mrs. Henley's expression became very carefully controlled, the look of someone who had learned to guard their words. I don't know the details, Your Highness. Personnel matters are handled by the security department, not by kitchen staff. But Isabella could see the tension in Mrs. Dewar. Henley's shoulders and the way her voice had become slightly strained. The cook knew more than she was saying, and she was clearly uncomfortable with whatever had happened to David. It just seems sad, Isabella continued, to lose a good worker because of something that might not even be their fault. Mrs. Henley stopped kneading and looked directly at Isabella, with an expression that was both compassionate and warning. Your Highness, palace employment comes with certain realities that those of us who work here accept. We understand that security is important, and we understand that difficult decisions sometimes have to be made. But that doesn't mean those decisions don't affect real people with real families and real dreams. Isabella realized that Mrs. Purchase could be. Henley was trying to communicate something important without saying it directly. The cook was acknowledging that the security system caused genuine harm to innocent people, but she was also warning Isabella to be careful about how deeply she pursued these issues. Mrs. Henley, Isabella said quietly, if you knew that good people were being hurt unfairly, wouldn't you want to do something about it? The older woman studied Isabella's face for a long moment, and Isabella could see her making some kind of internal decision. Your Highness, Mrs. Henley said finally, there are things about palace life that you will understand better when you're older. But I will say this. The people who work here are not just employees. We're human beings with complicated lives, and we deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. If someone in a position of power ever has the opportunity to ensure that fairness and compassion are part of how decisions are made, that would be a good thing. Isabella understood that Mrs. Henley was essentially giving her permission to pursue her investigation, while also making it clear that the cook couldn't be directly involved for her own protection. Armed with this tacit support, Isabella began to reach out to other staff members, always carefully and always with plausible reasons for the conversations. She learned about Thomas Chen's concerns that his work visa status made him vulnerable to arbitrary dismissal. She discovered that Sarah Williams lived in constant fear that her father's bankruptcy might somehow affect her own position. She found out that even Dr. Doggerville, Elizabeth Harper, despite her professional status, worried that her past addiction issues could be used against her if she ever disagreed with palace policies. Each conversation reinforced Isabella's understanding that the palace security system had created an atmosphere of fear and vulnerability among the very people who dedicated their lives to serving the royal family. People who should have felt secure and valued instead lived with the constant anxiety that their past mistakes or family situations could destroy their futures without warning. But Isabella also began to understand that changing this system would require more than just documenting its problems. She needed to propose realistic alternatives that would maintain necessary security while treating people with greater fairness and dignity. With this in mind, Isabella began researching how other royal families and government institutions handled personnel security. She spent hours in the palace library, studying everything from academic papers on employment law to case studies of security reforms in other countries. She learned about concepts like due process, appeals procedures, and proportional responses that could potentially be incorporated into palace policies. The more Isabella learned, the more convinced she became that reform was not only necessary but entirely feasible. Other institutions had found ways to balance security needs with employee rights, and there was no reason the palace couldn't do the same. But Isabella also realized that she couldn't implement these changes alone. She needed to convince someone with real authority that reform was necessary, and that someone would most likely have to be one of her parents. The question was how to approach them without revealing the full extent of her investigation or the security breaches she had committed. Isabella needed a way to present her concerns that would be taken seriously while protecting both herself and the people who had trusted her with their stories. After weeks of planning, Isabella decided to write a formal memorandum to her parents, outlining her concerns about palace employment policies and suggesting specific reforms. She would present it as the result of her growing interest in leadership and governance, rather than as the product of secret investigations and clandestine meetings. The memorandum that Isabella ultimately produced was 15 pages long and meticulously researched. It began by acknowledging the importance of security in protecting the royal family, but then systematically outlined the ways in which current policies created unnecessary hardships for loyal employees. Isabella proposed a series of reforms including clear appeals processes for employees who face dismissal for security reasons, regular reviews of personnel files to ensure that old or irrelevant information didn't continue to affect people's careers, greater transparency about what kinds of issues could affect someone's employment, support services for employees facing personal difficulties that might create security concerns, regular training for security personnel. On balancing security needs with human dignity, most importantly, Isabella proposed the creation of an independent ombudsman position, someone outside the security department who could review disputed cases and ensure that personnel decisions were fair and proportional. Isabella spent several sleepless nights perfecting the memorandum, knowing that this might be her only chance to make a real difference in the lives of people like David Mitchell, Mrs. Henley, and all the other palace employees who lived in fear of arbitrary punishment. On a cold morning in late November, Isabella requested a private meeting with her parents. When she presented them with her memorandum, she watched their faces carefully for their initial reactions. King Edmund read through the document with growing surprise, occasionally glancing up at his 12-year-old daughter with an expression of amazement. Queen Cordelia's reaction was more guarded, and Isabella could see her mother's sharp mind analyzing not just the content of the proposals, but also the implications of how Isabella had come to develop such detailed knowledge of palace personnel policies. "This is quite remarkable, Isabella," King Edmund said when he had finished reading. "You've clearly put a great deal of thought and research into these issues, but I'm curious, what prompted this interest in personnel management?"
Isabella had prepared for this question, but answering it still required careful navigation.
"I've been thinking about what kind of leader I want to be someday," she said honestly. "And I've realized that good leadership means caring about all the people who depend on your decisions, not just the ones who have power and influence." "That's admirable sentiment," Queen Cordelia said slowly. "But these are complex issues, Isabella. Security policies exist for important reasons, and changing them could have consequences that you might not fully understand." "I do understand that security is important, Mother," Isabella replied. "But I also think that treating people unfairly creates its own security risks. If employees don't trust the institution they work for, if they feel they could be dismissed without cause or explanation, that doesn't make the palace safer. It makes it more vulnerable." King Edmund and Queen Cordelia exchanged a long look that Isabella couldn't quite interpret. Finally, the king spoke. "You've raised some interesting points, Isabella. Your mother and I will need to discuss this with our security advisors and legal counsel. These aren't decisions we can make quickly or lightly." "But you'll consider the proposals?" Isabella asked hopefully.
We'll consider them, Queen Cordelia confirmed.
"Though I hope you understand that any changes would need to be implemented carefully and gradually." As Isabella left her parents' private study, she felt both hopeful and anxious. She had done everything she could to present a compelling case for reform while protecting the people who had trusted her with their stories. Now all she could do was wait and hope that her parents would have the wisdom and courage to do the right thing. 3 weeks later, King Edmund announced the creation of a Palace Personnel Review Commission, charged with examining current employment policies and recommending reforms that would balance security needs with fairness and transparency. The commission would be chaired by a retired judge and would include representatives from both the security department and the general palace staff. Isabella knew that her memorandum had planted the seed for this commission, but she also understood that real change would take time and sustained effort. The palace security system had been decades in the making, and reforming it would be a gradual process. But for the first time since discovering that crimson folder in the North Tower, Isabella felt hope. She had learned that even a 12-year-old princess could make a difference in the lives of people who had no other advocates. More importantly, she had discovered that true leadership meant using whatever power you had to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As she looked out her bedroom window at the palace grounds that had once seemed like a fairy tale kingdom, Isabella realized that she had grown up in ways that had nothing to do with age. She understood now that the world was more complex and sometimes more cruel than she had ever imagined. But she also understood that complexity and cruelty were not excuses for inaction. The Crimson Folder had revealed secrets that changed everything, but it had also revealed something else. The power of one person with courage and determination to challenge injustice and create change. And that, Isabella thought, was the most important discovery of all.